Welcome to 30 Minutes of Faith. We're happy to have Bhavani Girard with us, who is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Interfaith Council of Greater Sacramento and also an Interfaith minister. Welcome.
Thank you.
Glad you're here.
Thank you.
Will you tell us about your childhood and where you were raised and went to high school and those kinds of things?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and the thing I remember most about the street that I lived on was that there was a great big cathedral across the street from my home. And I spent a lot of time there. I've just been a devout person all my life, and so when my mother couldn't find me, that's where I was. I was spending time with God. So that's really the most significant thing I would say about my childhood. Loving family. We traveled a lot, and as I say, I was born in New York and ended up back in California. And I'm convinced that this is where God wants me now, because I've been brought right back to the Sacramento area 5 different times. My mother always wanted to live in California. She couldn't explain why, but she knew she wanted to live here. And so little by little, she convinced my father, and we came out to California. That's when I was 11. Well, we lasted 3 weeks. My father couldn't acclimate to California. So we went back to New York. And when I was grown, married, my husband and I decided we would come to California. And my husband, being of an engineer type, he made all these scientific decisions about, the fault, how to live on the right side of the fault, and the climate, and the population, and everything. And I ended right back in Sacramento. And my brother was visiting, helping me to move here many years ago. And we moved to Roseville. And so he looked around after we finished unpacking, and he said, this place looks awfully familiar. And I said, I think it does. And so we started driving, and less than a mile away, we found the house we had lived in when I was 11 years old. So 3 other times that same thing has happened. I've been brought back to California, back to Roseville, over and over and over again. So I figure this is where God wants me.
Were you raised in a religious home?
Yes. Again, it was more, it wasn't pushed on us in any way. It was just a sweet devotion. We're Italian Americans, and so our lives were filled with tradition. And so a big part of the tradition was our faith. And it was very natural. It was nothing that was, no pressure about it.
Do you still have a brother living or siblings living?
I do. We lost our sister, but I have my brother. And he lives nearby in Marin, so we're pretty close.
So a happy childhood, a happy adolescence?
Yes, I would have to say. I did not seriously suffer in any way. I think in large part, though, because I had a strong core. So what other people might have gone through and considered that suffering, I didn't.
It's remarkable for those of us who have never gone to bed hungry or hurt or harmed, who were always sheltered and clothed and fed. Your parents living?
No.
And are they buried on the East Coast?
No. Actually, they made it out to California eventually. 2 or 3 times after I made it, they came back out again. And they're both down in Riverside.
Now, you said your husband and family. I know you have children.
I do. I have 4 children, all grown. 2 of them, my 2 older children, live in Virginia, and they've given me some grandchildren recently, in recent years. So I have 4 grandchildren and 1 on the way. And then my younger children are 11 years younger than my older children, and they're twins. So they've kept me very young. And they are not, one is married, and 1 is not.
Everyone's healthy and doing well.
They are. They're all doing really well.
Has anything ever happened to you better than motherhood?
Absolutely not.
Thank you.
I say that vehemently.
I agree with that as a father. How about your hobbies? Do you have things you do in your spare time?
I love to hike. I love being out in nature. So hiking is a big thing. I don't like to encumber myself with backpacks and things like that. So I like to have my hands free and just walk. That's what I love to do best. I love to garden for that reason. I'd be a farmer if I had enough land to farm.
And are you in good health?
Yes.
Now, one of the things I'm aware of is you have a singing group, or you're involved in a singing group?
No. No, I think you're referring to the Kirtan group that I happened to mention several times. Kirtan group is a group of, Kirtan itself is very much a reflection of my path, which is yoga, which comes from the Indian tradition. And we practice many different techniques that help us to experience God's presence. And Kirtan is one of them because we chant. And chanting is a very personal interaction between the person chanting and God. And so what we do sometimes is we have what's called a kirtan, which is where we chant repeatedly, many chants over and over again for an hour, hour and a half, maybe longer. And just use that whole technique of chanting to increase our inspiration, raise our energy, and give us the divine experience.
And how did you come to your path?
Come to my path. Well, yoga is a vast subject, and many people today know it through its physical practices of asana and pranayama, known as hatha yoga. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. However, many of us come to the practice of yoga from that direction, and that was so for me, because that was what was most obvious back. It's been many years now, over 30 years. But the more I practiced that and began to notice changes in myself, at the same time I was doing a lot of intense Bible study. And I began to realize that as a result of my practice, I became more calm, more centered, more clear of mind. I gained a lot of mental clarity through this practice of asana and meditation and pranayama, which are the postures and the breathing exercises. And I began to develop a really deep respect for what was happening through these ancient practices. They're thousands of years old, and they include the practice of meditation. At that point, I hadn't been introduced to meditation itself. But I already, through those first two techniques, noticed that the change in me helped me to go deeper in my spiritual studies because of that mental clarity that it gave me. And I remember that this was over 3 or 4 years that I really had time to notice these changes. And I would remember we would discuss in our Bible study group what we thought, some passages meant. And then over the days intervening before our next meeting, little by little, I would have these realizations that would help me to say, oh, that's what that means. That's those deeper meanings. That's what that's all about. So I started to put the two together. And I began to realize that the practice of yoga would help enhance any tradition or belief system or whatever spiritual aspiration I might have. So at that point, I decided to become a serious yogi. And I started looking for, a true teacher. And I knew that there was a vast body of teachings around this practice that I was only just beginning to learn about. And so that's what brought me to the path of yoga.
And you follow a particular faith or group?
Well, in the practice of yoga, we don't talk about faith because what we're trying to do is have direct perception. So it's not based on a belief system. It's based on direct experience. And so again, one can practice any outward cultural tradition, any religion, and still be a yogi. So one can be a Christian yogi or a Jewish yogi or a Buddhist yogi or Muslim yogi. It doesn't really matter. Because what we simply do is take those, yoga is considered a philosophy, it's considered a science, but not a religion, because there's no commitment to a belief system. Instead, we can have our own belief system, whatever that might be, but we take those techniques of asana, pranayama, kirtan, affirmations, meditation, standard techniques known to many traditions, but we take them and focus on them and approach them in a very deliberate, disciplined way. And that, as I said, through the years has been an enormous bonus in helping me to gain spiritual realization that might have taken a lot longer if I didn't know these practices. So yes, I follow a guru, Paramahansa Yogananda. He came to America in 1920, long before the 60s when a lot of Indian teachers came. So he was one of the first ones. And he's highly regarded in our field, in the field of yoga. He wrote a great classic known as Autobiography of a Yogi that was published in 1946. And it's a very well-known book and used in many college classes. And many people read it. It doesn't mean that everybody who reads it becomes a disciple of Yogananda, but his book gives a broad overview of what yoga is all about. And that's the great blessing and gift that he gave to people in in writing that book.
Now, I sat with you in a gathering some months ago. It was an Ananda gathering. Was I in church?
You know, I think many of us coming through the 60s who didn't, a lot of people, I'm not saying me myself, because I've always been comfortable with church. Growing up as a Roman Catholic, I loved being in church. I don't have any resistance to that concept. And I never turned my back on it as I became a yogi. I just took it with me. But for a lot of people, the idea of church has negative connotations for them. For whatever reason, that concept didn't work for them. And so a lot of people don't like to consider Ananda as a church. As a legal body, it is a church. It's a legal entity as a church body. But it's not so much, the emphasis is not so much on the institution as it is on the inner path. That's what yoga is really all about. So we tend not to emphasize it in that way.
That was a very pleasurable experience for me. There was good teaching and good music and the chanting and other sorts of things that was satisfying and relaxing.
The path is very joyful. It's all about joy. It's not about, it's a path that doesn't say, as in the past many paths have said, through pain and suffering you can know God. In the yoga path, it's through joy and self-discipline and self-control that you can know God.
Now, could you travel anywhere else in the United States or internationally and find a group like that on a
Absolutely.
morning?
In fact, Yogananda is known worldwide, and there are Yogananda meditation groups and centers around the world. But then there are also Ananda meditation groups and centers around the world. I'm connected to the Ananda group, which was founded by Swami Kriyananda, who was a direct disciple, is a direct disciple. He's elderly now, but he's just turned 84. He was a direct disciple. He was with the master. And he came in 1948, and Yogananda passed away in 1952. So he had 4 years of direct training with Yogananda. And so it's been a great joy for us. Swami Kriyananda started the Ananda community up in Nevada City, and that's been around now for 40 years. He started in the 60s. And it's a wonderful place for people to go and to spend some time there. It's a community, you can live there, and it gives you a chance to develop your practice and establish yourself in the spiritual life.
Does the finding of yourself in this practice qualify as spiritual?
Absolutely.
And what would you say is the huge difference between spirituality and organized religion?
Well, I think that I've given this some thought how to explain it. Every tradition, most wisdom traditions, we'll say, have an exoteric pattern side to it and an esoteric pattern, an inner and an outer side to it. In the most general way, I would say that the exoteric part, the outer part, we could call religion, because that often includes, good advice on how to be happy and healthy in your life, how to live in a positive way, how to interact with people in a positive way. It often involves the history of a group. It's always got dogma, which is a belief system, the set of tenets that tradition upholds, and that people who are part of that tradition aspire to and accept. Whereas the esoteric part is the inner part, and that not everybody who practices the outer part practices the inner part as well. We're all at different stages in our development and in our understanding. But all traditions, I would have to say that most that I've come across do have that inner part. It's not like everybody has to suddenly call the inner part yoga. The inner part, yoga means union. Yoga means the interiorization of the consciousness. So that happens anytime you're practicing the inner part of any tradition. And they all have practices that involve breathing exercises and right diet and right living and all of that. So the difference between religion and spirituality, I would say, is religion would be the practice of the outer part, and developing your spirituality, getting in touch with your own spirit nature. That's the inner part.
Good answer. Very nice. Do you get to go up to the Nevada City community on some yearly basis, or?
I get up there several times a year. I lived up there twice in the past. When my twins were really little, it was probably crazy to take them up to the woods for 2 years, but we did. It was fun. Then later on, when everybody was grown, I went up and lived there for 10 years during the 90s. And it was wonderful. Nobody ever wants to leave Ananda, but one leaves when it's time to share outside the community.
That would lead us naturally into, you do a lot of teaching and you're authorized and certified to do that. Will you explain, first of all, what you do as a teacher, but I'd also like you to talk a little bit about the difference between the teacher and the student.
Okay. I first became a minister back in 1981. Swami Kriyananda ordained me. And at the same time, I was already a teacher because when I had first been introduced to Hatha Yoga, I loved it and eventually started teaching it. So I had already been teaching for several years before I actually even found Ananda. As I said, I was looking for a path to seriously study. So at that point in the early 80s, I was ordained a minister. Something that was just naturally bestowed on me. I had never thought before that maybe I should be a minister, but once I became a minister, it seemed like, of course, that was the right thing. Of course, that's my calling. But my ministry has not been congregational in any way. My teaching is my ministry, and my students are my congregation. So that's how my own ministry has unfolded. And so some years later, I also took training as an interfaith minister. So I have 2 ordinations, one as a minister from the yoga path and one as an interfaith minister. And would you repeat that second part of the question, please?
Well, what's involved in the differences between being the teacher or being the student?
Yes. Well, when Swami ordained us, and even when he just asked people to be a teacher, I got very good training from him. He sat us all down and he said, now don't you for a moment think that somehow you're special because you're being given this role to play. He said, no, the reason you're made a teacher is because that's what you need to do in order to grow. And I've never forgotten that, and I've never known one Ananda minister to have a big head, ever. Because what he was saying was, if you have to be the teacher, if your responsibility is to share the teachings with other people, then you have to know those teachings. That means you have to study. That means you have to walk your talk. That means you have to develop your ability to communicate in ways that people can understand. And in doing that, you really learn the teachings. And you stay quite humble in the process. So I would have to say, at least in my experience, I've always considered myself the student till today and probably all my life. I'll never be not a student because I'm always hoping that I'm growing and studying and working hard toward my goal. But I would have to say teaching's pretty important. It's a great role to have if, in fact, you really want to focus on what's the most important to you.
The group that I sat with there several months ago, do you do other things with those people beyond just gathering together on Sunday morning?
Well, the unique thing about the Ananda experience is that it is a community. One of Yogananda's goals when he came to America was to encourage people of like mind to gather together. And so, of course, people in faith traditions understand that it's a spiritual community. But in Yogananda's case, he also encouraged people to go out in the woods, live simply, and be together so that your friends would be your fellow devotees. And you would worship together, you would work together, you would raise your children together, you would go on vacations together. Basically, you would work together so that every day of your life, you saw each other and mirrored back to each other what your goals truly were. And it helps you not to forget. So Ananda, the community of Ananda is very much the fulfillment of a dream of Yogananda's, that these spiritual communities should take hold. So Swami Kriyananda has said that even when he was a young man, he wanted to start a community. And then when he became a disciple of Yogananda and he realized that that was one of Yogananda's dreams as well, he decided he was going to do it. So that he came to Nevada City in 1968, and he brought his students from San Francisco, and they started this community. It's got a great history. So we're very much of the concept of community. So after a while, after about 10 years, Swami decided that we pretty much had the idea of community down. It was working well in Nevada City, and so he started branch communities. And the one in Sacramento was the first one. Now we have Portland, Seattle, Dallas, Rhode Island, and we have 2 big communities, one in India and one in Assisi, Italy.
Do your children follow the yoga path?
Of the 4 of them, they're all very good people, very good people. My 2 older children have not followed the path in any real outward sense because as I came to it, they were already grown and their lives have gone in different directions. But the twins grew up at Ananda. There's a school there, and they had a much more integral experience with the community and with the teachings, and so they're much more connected to them.
I ask you that because my wife and I have 5 children, and I guess when the first baby was born, I just thought all of our babies would be the same. And they
Not so.
come with such distinct personalities and direction and choices.
And from what a yogi would say, also their own karma, in the sense of their own mission. They all come. We each come in with a different purpose for this particular incarnation. And I know I learned very early on to respect that. As my children grew into their teenage years and I watched them grow up, I've always supported them in whatever direction they wanted to go, because their life is not my life. I had certain things to work on in this life, and I've been pursuing them diligently with great dedication. And I hope that they will do the same as they realize what their life's goals are.
We continue to tease our children about we have a life. We're still doing certain things. And
we're not done yet.
do you have a holy writ of any form or substance that you follow?
Well, the philosophy of yoga comes out of the Indian tradition, which we call the Vedic tradition because we date it back to the Vedas, which are thousands of years old. And out of the Vedas have come many holy scriptures. The Vedas themselves originally were an oral tradition and eventually got written down. And then there are many different holy books that have come down, each one kind of restating the truth in a way that's appropriate for the people of that time. So we hold mostly to the to the Bhagavad Gita, which was written maybe 2,500 years ago, maybe a little bit more. It dates back much further, but it got written down around that time. And I really love that scripture because I call it the Yogi's Handbook. It's only 18 chapters, and it's part of a much bigger epic called the Mahabharata. But the Yogi's Handbook is that 18 chapters that describes the path of yoga. All the teachings of yoga I write in those 18 chapters. So as yogis, we refer to that book more than any of the others.
Do you think it's essential that as a community in a greater Sacramento that we be a spiritual people, or can we survive nicely with some who may not be?
Well, I think everybody does better as a spiritual person. In terms of individuals, the answer can only be, we'll be better off if we're all spiritual. But if you're asking about acceptance and tolerance of people who are not striving in that same way, again, the answer is of course, because anyone who wants to be spiritual is about inclusivity, not being exclusive, but it's about welcoming everybody, because we understand that we're all a part of each other, we're all a part of God. So we can't isolate or separate out certain individuals because we don't like them for some reason. God made us all.
75 years ago, the emphasis in America was sort of on a council of churches where we would try to get along. But it seems like in the last generation, Interfaith has really come to life. What brought you to Interfaith in Sacramento?
Yogananda's path, the path of yoga, is an interfaith path. As I said, we don't distinguish between one religion or the other in the sense that only certain people can practice yoga. Instead, we say it doesn't matter what religion you are. You can still practice yoga if you want or not. But so my training is very universal. The path of yoga is universal. It doesn't separate or distinguish individual ways of doing things. It just says if they work for a person, they're fine. So how did I come to Interfaith? Is that what you asked?
Yes.
So because that is the attitude of the yogi anyway. When I had the opportunity to become an interfaith minister, I really resonated with that. In fact, I remember someone at one of those early meetings that I went to saying, as he looked around the room of all the people sitting there, it was an informational meeting, you know, what is this training all about? And he said, I would like to suggest that maybe every one of you sitting here at this table has a little bit different point of view from the other people in your tradition. And what he was saying, when he elaborated on that, was that we had a somewhat broader vision. In other words, while we loved our tradition, we were totally dedicated to our tradition, we still accepted that other people's traditions were just as valid and just as right for them. And so I think everyone around the table went, that's right, that's us. And so that's when I knew that the studies in interfaith were right for me and that it would be quite appropriate to become an interfaith minister.
Is there something in interfaith that you're passionate about, that you feel like is a trend that should be established stronger?
Well, interfaith education is right at the top of my list. I know what a difference it made to me to directly study each faith tradition when I was going through my training, to directly meet people who loved their tradition, were inspired by it, had been transformed by it, to read the holy books, to go directly to the book and not listen to what somebody else's opinion of that book might be. That has made all the difference. So I'm pretty dedicated to interfaith education, trying to foster and promote programs that help us each to go to the root, go to the source, and help us each to realize one-on-one for ourselves, not because of what somebody else told us, that in fact God's presence is in all these traditions and that we should respect them. Those who live in this way, who are happy with who they are and their own spirituality, they don't hurt anybody else and they don't hate anybody else.
Okay, when you wish upon a star, is there something you wish you could wave your magic wand and change?
I just wish we could all try harder to accept each other and to love each other.
Thank you. It's nice to have you here. Nice to visit with you.
You too.
We've been visiting with Bhavani Girard, an interfaith minister and member of the Board of Trustees. Thank you again.